And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome 3 international scientists. We are fortunate enough that you have traveled here, and we will be starting with you, Martin Jung. So please come forward. Yeah, you're here. And you have 12 minutes.
Yeah, remind me, I will speed up a little bit otherwise.
No. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
All right. So thank you everyone for inviting me. It's very impressed to see this wonderful big audience, and it's also very grateful for me personally to be back in Denmark. I did my master's degree here almost 10 years ago, so it's great to be back in this wonderful city. My name is... this is sadly lost. But my name is Martin. I'm from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, from Austria. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the European perspective on land. Europe's protected area network is incredibly heterogeneous, but also incredibly widespread, covering all major realms, and is meant to really be the main instrument protecting biodiversity on land. And in the past, particularly the Natura 2000 initiatives since 1992, but also the other national initiatives have really been put forward to protect the remaining bits. But when you look at it on a spatial representation and also in a range of statistics, we find that our existing network is still lacking a lot. It's very disparate in space. It has, as you can see on the right, which is a bar plot of the area size distributions of protected areas. And the ones on the bars on the 2 left are the protected areas which are actually below 10 kilometers square big, and the 67%, and half of that is even smaller than 1 square kilometer. So we really have established a lot of protected areas, but they're really tiny, they're fragmented, they're all over the place. So as a response, in Europe, there is the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030 with the ambition to legally protect 30% of the land and sea, as well as 1/3 of that being strictly protected. It also includes restoration of 20% of the land, or actively, passively assisting towards good condition, and the facilitation of ecological corridors and sustainable land management, while also increasing the resilience towards climate change mitigation and adaptation. So, with all these big goals, and how do we actually get there? Well, at the moment, according to the European Environmental Agency's own accounting, the European 27 states are roughly at 26 to 26.1% of land area and sea that's currently covered under protection. And the main instrument that has been put forward for individual member states in the EU27 was to make pledges. What are individual member states' pledges to actually increase their own protection in any way? However, as it stands now, only 7 member states out of all 27 have actually made any pledges to the European Commission. Denmark, France, Germany, Luxembourg, Spain, Sweden, and Czechia being among them. And of course, the pledges also differing quite a bit in their level of ambition. But there's, of course, also different aspects of these stories. Generally, at a larger event that we had at the Biogeographic Seminar Series, which is a series that invites spatial planners and national authorities across Europe to discuss actually the issues behind the European Biodiversity Strategy, we asked them actually what were the main barriers towards pledging, what were the main barriers towards implementing strict protection and other big goals. And what you can see here is really it's political will, it's interest, of course. It's also funds. There's a lack of dedicated budget attribution for many of these efforts, but also conflicting interest and sectoral conflicts with landowners and so forth. But one thing that I really want to highlight on this because it picks always up, is the issue of definition and clarity. And actually, what is meant by protection? What do we mean by protection? And this has been even more become a discussion with the so-called strict protection target, which, as the European Union, compared to, for instance, the global biodiversity framework, which only has 30% and no strict protection target, has really put forward as an ambitious goal here. In the European guidance documents on protected areas, strict protection were defined as strictly protected areas that should be non-intervention areas, and where active management should be the exception to the rule. And this really separates it, for instance, from Natura 2000 sites, because all Natura 2000 sites have, or should have, a management plan that actually guides how they're being managed and what is being allowed, do's or don'ts within them. For strict protection, it's really the way we want to have this really key aspect where we protect nature as it is and leave it in the most pristine state. However, even on that definition, when this was placed to member states, there was a lot of discussion. How are we going to implement that? This does not occur in many of the countries. 2 weeks ago, there was a larger event in Brussels, in a strict protection workshop, where actually several invitees from member states and scientists and interested parties were invited to actually discuss, okay, how can we make this definition of strict protection actually EU applicable? And it circled a lot about these 3 corners, which is essentially we can strictly protect the intact nature, the undisturbed land, the wilderness. We can do that, but then of course much of the effort in Europe will fall on very few countries because these lands are incredibly rare, as you can imagine. We can strictly protect the vulnerable species and habitats, so those where really you have like 2-3 species populations left or like one single occurrence, and these are really without really strict legal enforcement, there would be no way to safeguard them. Or we could implement strict protection in a way that it's more an intervention focus, as in we know that certain habitats are under active current and future threats because of climate change, because of land use demands, and strict protection becomes essentially a guard, a stopping block that actually prevents these habitats from further decline. And that's really a bit the different nuances that are currently going on. And of course, every member state, I imagine also in Denmark, has a different view of where this is going. And anyway, on the pledges side, the European Union officially, before departing to one of the larger international intervention committees, recently acknowledged that due to the limited number of pledges that have been submitted by member states, the European Commission himself actually do not have at the moment enough information to actually know is the EU achieving its protected area target, because most member states not even reporting it. So this was a quote from the outgoing MEP for environmental matters, and of course the new commission now really has to put also a bit on hands. And the perception, at least from the European Commission side, is really that at the moment the pledge process was really serving to build up a momentum towards biodiversity protection. And now we are focusing a lot more on the monitoring what is actually being done and where it is done and what's being done by the member state. And it should, of course, also be highlighted that not everything is bleak with this. There's been a lot going on in Europe, many things that are not obviously to protected areas, but also attributed to it. The Nature Restoration Regulation, for instance, has a huge incentive, of course, to also restore the great land that can ultimately also benefit to protected areas. At the same time, there are also several countries which have very, very ambitious sectoral commitments. To give you an example, Romania has pledged to put 10% of the national forest area under unharvested, undisturbed lands, essentially. They are not protected areas, but they're also large consecutive pieces of land that basically are completely left on their own. So in that sense, fulfilling the criteria of wilderness or undisturbed land, if you will. So at the same time, there's also a number of member states who are still making considerable commitments to international treaties. For instance, a couple months ago was the Global Biodiversity Frameworks debate in Cali, in Colombia, and they agreed to put a huge the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund forward, where really the aim is also to support biodiversity protection globally and within Europe to providing the dedicated funding avenue. Generally, from my perspective, what we always should not forget, and this is really the reminder here, when we look back at the European 2020, back then, we didn't have a biodiversity target, but we had a habitat strategy. And back then, the key word was the IT targets, the 17% that we would need to reach. Europe back then handsomely reached the 70%. It was not an issue. We reached it even 1 year before the official deadline, in that sense. But the real question we need to ask is, what has been the impact of these 17%? What you see here on the right, this bar plot, is a figure from the European States of Nature report. This is the number of species in the European Birds and Habitats Directive who actually reached favorable condition. So where the population were in good status and good condition. And the green dark bar is where they started in 2010. The light green bar is where they ended up. The red line on the very right was actually the target for 2020. So none of the targets for the habitats or species have been actually reached, even in 2020. And we have to ask us, even if we expand protection by area, we need to make sure that it does its impact. So, and I really want to put that forward, protection in itself, area-based protection, is only a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. It is a means to reach favorable outcomes for biodiversity. Besides focusing on outcomes, what are the pathways forwards? From our perspective, it's conservation planning, the application, multi-scale engagements, and better knowledge sharing. In terms of conservation planning, I usually apply here the so-called CARE principles. This means that every expansion of conservation areas, it should be comprehensive. It should cover the whole breadth of life. It should cover insects, plants, vertebrates, and so forth, as much as possible. They should be adequate. They should be not too small, and they should be well connected within the landscape to also enable corridors. It should be resilient towards future climate risks and pressures. And it should be effective in a way that there's sustainable financing and a long-term monitoring and management plan. And to show you some results, the project that I'm representing on is called Natur Connect. We are identifying across Europe priority areas for strict protection, conventional protection, restoration, and ecological corridors. And one of the preliminary results that really picks out when we zoom in into some of these results is that the areas where really these key areas are, where we potential protection expansions could be, and where corridors are really areas between countries. It's not necessarily centered within the countries, but often between borders, between regions that are shared, also in their legal responsibility. So I really want to stress that effective conservation at the European scale requires that there is an international collaboration also among member states. Even though the implementation happens at the member state level, it cannot be seen in isolation. Countries need to look beyond their borders. Furthermore, implementation requires a multi-scale policy engagements. There needs to be a stakeholder buy-in along the whole process, from the planning, the designation, and the implementation, and the long-term management. Just making a legislation on its own does not create facts on the ground. And the same comes ultimately that effective conservation builds really on this intersection between legislators providing the favorable boundary conditions of how and where protection could be attributed, and the local empowerment of communities and those that are actually on the ground, and the councils, which are, and the civil society, of course, who are actually being involved in the daily management and the caring of the land. Lastly, how the Natur Connect project can support. We, as a pan-European initiative to identify protected area priorities, we provide a series of guidelines and fact sheets. For instance, we have recently produced one that outlines funding opportunities for expanding protected areas in Portugal in the face of climate change. And similar funding fact sheets will be released for the rest of Europe as well. We're making available lots of openly available data for species, habitats, ecosystem services that are available for everyone for free to look at, and also, of course, European-wide priority maps and restoration areas, so that every country and member state representatives can really see what are other countries' opportunities to do something good. And also then follow up, of course, have they done it or not? Have they done their homework? And lastly, we're also providing a range of tools and training, such as, for instance, competence assessments for protected area managers, how they can actually doing a more inclusive and directed protected area planning. And that's it for me. Tusen tack for this listening. And yeah, with that.